Take a good, long look at that face. That is the face of a killer. A girl who murdered her own father. And not just him. Because what you're looking at right now is the youngest girl in British history ever convicted of double murder. Summer of 2009, Ipswich, England. And sitting in the defendant's chair is a 15-year-old girl named Lorraine Thorpe. The jury, the judge, the prosecutors, and everyone in that city was in a state of shock. Not just because of what she'd done, but because of how young she was when she did it. And the question that hung over that entire courtroom, the question everyone desperately wanted answered, was simple. Why? To understand that, you have to go back to the beginning, to the house where Lorraine Thorpe grew up. That house was chaos. 11 brothers and sisters under one roof, and parents who had absolutely zero interest in actually raising any of them. What they were interested in was alcohol. There was no real parenting happening, no focused attention on any individual child, no structure, no guidance, just neglect. And to be clear, the available records don't indicate that the parents were violent or physically abusive. They simply didn't care. When Lorraine was 12 years old, her parents split up. And what happened next set everything in motion. Lorraine stayed with her father, a man struggling with severe alcohol dependency. From that point on, things deteriorated with terrifying speed. Life with her father was not what any child's life should look like. They were constantly moving from one place to the next, and most of those places weren't fit for a grown adult, let alone a young girl. Lorraine and her father lived outside, in tents, in some of the worst parts of the city. Social services stepped in and removed her multiple times. But every time, she went right back. Back to her father. Back to the drinking and the darkness. Back to the only life she knew. According to court documents, at some point the dynamic shifted completely. This child became her father's caretaker. His health had been destroyed by years of alcoholism, and Lorraine was the one looking after him. Her defense attorney would later describe this arrangement by social services as utterly unacceptable. On top of everything else, Lorraine had been diagnosed with ADHD. Any medication she was supposed to be taking for it? She either wasn't taking it at all, or she was washing it down with vodka. By the time she was 14 years old, she wasn't coming home from school to a house. She was coming home to a tent, where her drunk father was waiting, and where dinner was a bottle of hard liquor they shared together. She had no friends her own age. She barely went to school. The people around her, the ones who became her teachers, her community, her entire world, were significantly older adults from the local drinking scene. And these weren't just people who drank too much. These were low-level criminals who funded their habits through petty theft that regularly turned violent. Lorraine's defense would argue throughout the trial that this environment left her completely unable to distinguish right from wrong. She had no moral compass whatsoever. To her, all of it, everything that was happening around her, and eventually through her, was just a game. One of the central figures in that world was a 41-year-old man named Paul Clark. Clark had a certain kind of dominance over the people around him. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make him the one calling the shots in that group. And Lorraine was completely taken with him. Any suggestion of a sexual relationship between them was denied during the investigation. What we do know is that Clark had his own apartment, and eventually Lorraine and her father moved in with him. The atmosphere inside that apartment was toxic. The people in it were almost never sober, and Lorraine, already unraveling, became increasingly out of control and aggressive with each passing day. Now, another person you need to know about. A 41-year-old woman named Rosalind Hunt. Everyone called her Rosie. She lived alone after her divorce, and she also struggled with alcohol. She was well known in this particular social circle. Rosie had been given council housing in the neighborhood, and the whole group would frequently gather at her place. Her own brother would later suggest that Rosie was being used, that all these people wanted from her was a place to drink and crash for the night, and that Rosie, for her part, just wanted to feel needed. And then came the incident that lit the fuse. Paul Clark had a dog. On one occasion, Rosie took the dog for a walk, and at some point during that walk, the dog tried to bite someone. Rosie yanked hard on the leash and hit the dog on the head. Word got back to Paul Clark. He was furious, absolutely livid, and he made it known to everyone around him that Rosie was not going to get away with that. Rosie, scared of what Paul might do, went to Desmond Thorpe's apartment, Lorraine's father. By that time, the local council had finally stepped in due to Desmond's failing health, moving him out of the tents and providing him with a small social apartment of his own. It was supposed to be a safe haven for him and a temporary shelter for Rosie to lay low until things cooled down. Then Lorraine showed up. She approached Rosie and convinced her that there was nothing to worry about, that Paul wasn't going to do anything to her, that the best thing to do, the smart thing to do, was for everyone to get together, talk it out, and put the whole thing behind them. Rosie thought that sounded reasonable. She agreed to go. The moment Rosie walked into Paul Clark's apartment, she was not going to walk back out on her own. What followed was 2 weeks of torture. Paul and Lorraine took a cheese grater, the kind you'd find in any kitchen, and used it on Rosie's skin. Then they rubbed salt into the wounds to make it hurt more. This went on, and on, and on, for 2 weeks. At some point, they moved Rosie to her own apartment and continued there. A neighbor heard the screaming coming from that apartment and called the police. Officers responded, knocked on the door, and heard nothing, so they turned around and left. Inside that apartment at that very moment, Rosie, Lorraine, and Paul were all sitting completely still and silent, waiting for them to go away. Once the police were gone, Lorraine and Paul walked to a pharmacy and bought sleeping pills. The plan was to drug Rosie and then stage her death to look like either natural causes or a suicide. The problem was that Rosie's body was already covered in wounds, far too many, far too visible to cover anything up. The overdose plan failed, and so they made a new decision. They were going to beat her to death. It happened on August 9th. The forensic examination of Rosalind Hunt's body found extensive injuries to the chest and abdomen, 9 broken ribs, and the medical examiner confirmed that she was alive when she received every single one of those injuries. Lorraine Thorpe was the most active participant in what was done to her. Not long after, the neighbor called police again. She hadn't seen Rosie in days. There were flies swarming around the apartment. Officers went inside and found the body. The official cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. Here's where it takes another turn. Lorraine wasn't keeping any of this a secret. She was bragging about it. Walking around the neighborhood, going back to the same drinking circles, and openly telling people what they'd done to Rosie. Talking about the torture with a smile on her face, laughing about it. This information eventually made its way to Desmond Thorpe, Lorraine's father. And to his credit, the man was horrified. He was seriously considering going to the police and turning his own daughter in. But instead of doing that quietly, he started telling people what he was thinking about doing. And those people told other people. And eventually, word got back to Lorraine and Paul. They went to Desmond's apartment. The conversation started calmly. They worked to reassure him, telling him it was all lies, that none of it was true, that people were just making things up. Desmond seemed to settle down. He relaxed, and eventually he went to bed. While he slept, Lorraine and Paul picked up a pillow and smothered him. And after he was dead, after her own father was already gone, Lorraine kicked him in the head. The very next day, police had already been called to Rosalind Hunt's apartment where her body was discovered. Then came a second call. Desmond Thorpe had been found dead in his apartment as well. Initially, investigators assumed he'd died of natural causes. His lifestyle was well documented, and his blood alcohol level at the time of death was enormous. But detectives quickly noticed something. There was an impact mark on his head. Then, in the bushes nearby, they found Desmond's pillow, with traces of blood on it. And local witnesses confirmed they had seen Lorraine and Paul leaving the apartment around the estimated time of death. Both of them were arrested. Both denied everything. Lorraine acknowledged that the shoe print found on her father's head matched her shoe, but she claimed she had no idea how it got there. Investigators initially went into this believing that Lorraine was just a puppet, a teenager being manipulated and controlled by an older, dominant man in Paul Clark. The trial made it very clear that was not the case. The proceedings were difficult from the start. Most of the witnesses were alcoholics or drug users, and the defense worked hard to have their testimony thrown out. But in the end, it was Lorraine herself who sealed her fate. Her behavior in that courtroom was extraordinary. She was sarcastic. She cracked jokes. She laughed at the level of violence she and Paul had inflicted on Rosalind Hunt. She showed absolutely no remorse, no empathy, nothing. Witnesses recalled that she and Paul Clark were constantly snickering together at the defense table, like all of it was one big joke. The trial also revealed that in late June of 2009, Lorraine had been taken into protective custody by social services and removed from that environment, but she had escaped and gone straight back to Paul Clark. There was also testimony suggesting that it was Rosie herself who had told social services where to find Lorraine, which meant that on top of everything else, Rosie's act of trying to help this girl may have been one of the reasons she was targeted in the first place. Based on the forensic evidence and witness testimony, the jury found both defendants guilty of double murder. Paul Clark received a life sentence. Lorraine Thorpe also received a life sentence, with a minimum term of 14 years before she would become eligible to apply for parole. In sentencing her, the judge stated clearly that Lorraine Thorpe was personally responsible for the prolonged and brutal attacks on a helpless Rosalind Hunt, that she was proud of what she had done, and that she was not acting under Clark's influence or control. She had shown herself to be willful, strong, and extraordinarily manipulative. On September 1st, 2014, Paul Clark died by suicide in his prison cell. In the summer of 2023, Lorraine Thorpe applied for early release. She was denied. She remains behind bars, continuing to serve her life sentence.